The wind howled through the cracks of the old lighthouse, carrying with it the scent of salt and the distant echo of waves crashing against the cliffs below. Thomas stood at the top, his hand gripping the iron railing as he stared out at the churning sea. The light, his light, swept across the darkness in rhythmic arcs, a solitary beacon in the vast emptiness. It was the one thing he could control, the one promise he still had the strength to keep. "Keep the light burning for me, Thomas." Those were the last words Eleanor had spoken before the sickness had taken her. Her voice still haunted him, as soft and warm as the spring breeze that used to dance around their small cottage by the sea. She had been his guiding star, and now, even in death, she remained the compass by which he navigated his lonely existence. The lighthouse had become his sanctuary. It was a place where the world could not touch him, where time itself seemed to slow, allowing him to linger in the past where Eleanor still smiled at him from across the kitchen table. In the rhythmic hum of the rotating lens, he found a kind of peace, a way to fulfill the promise he'd made to her in those final moments. But it was more than that. The light wasn't just for Eleanor. It was for the sailors out there, battling the same storms that now raged inside him. Each night, he would climb the spiral staircase, tending to the flame with the same care he'd once shown to her, making sure it burned bright enough to guide them home. If the light went out, he feared more than just losing the ships. He feared losing the last piece of Eleanor he still had. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the glass panes of the lantern room. Thomas turned his gaze toward the horizon, watching as storm clouds gathered in the distance. He sighed, knowing another rough night was ahead. But that was the nature of his duty. Come storm or calm, he had to keep the light burning. As he made his way back down the spiral staircase, the familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath his boots echoed through the tower. At the base, his old oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. The shadows danced like ghosts, their forms indistinct but ever-present, a reminder of what he'd lost. He couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was among them, watching him, waiting for him to fulfill his promise. He crossed the small room where the lighthouse keeper's tools were kept, his fingers brushing against the brass instruments and old journals. Everything in this place had a purpose, a rhythm, just like the sea. He had learned long ago that life by the sea required a certain acceptance of its unpredictability. The storms would come, and they would pass, but the lighthouse must endure, just as he had to. The village below the lighthouse had long accepted Thomas's seclusion. To them, he was little more than a ghost, the keeper of the light they relied on but rarely saw. His connection to them had faded in the years since Eleanor's death, and only the most essential interactions remained. A monthly trip to the village store, brief exchanges with the dockworkers, and nods of acknowledgement to those who passed by him on the way to the market. But Mara had noticed more than most. She watched him from a distance, her own grief intertwined with his. Losing her brother to the sea had planted a bitterness in her heart, a bitterness she now directed toward the lighthouse and, by extension, its keeper. In her eyes, the light had failed him. It had failed to save the one person she cared about most. Yet Thomas continued to keep it burning, as if nothing had changed. One afternoon, as the wind began to pick up and the scent of an impending storm filled the air, Mara made her way to the path that led to the lighthouse. She had never spoken to Thomas before, not properly, but today something inside her demanded she confront him. She had to know, how could he stand there every night, lighting the way for strangers when the sea had taken so much from both of them? The path was steep, winding its way up the rocky cliffs. By the time she reached the top, her legs ached, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The wind whipped at her hair, tangling it around her face as she paused in front of the towering structure. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. The lighthouse loomed above her, its presence both comforting and foreboding. She saw Thomas through the window, moving about in his slow, methodical way. He hadn't noticed her yet. Gathering her resolve, Mara stepped forward and knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed in the small stone chamber beyond, and she heard his footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and there he stood, as tall and solid as she had imagined, though his eyes looked hollow, as if the light inside him had long since dimmed. He said nothing, simply gazing at her with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. "I need to talk to you," Mara said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "About the lighthouse, about the light." Thomas raised an eyebrow but stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The room was just as she'd imagined, bare, practical, and steeped in the scent of oil and sea salt. Everything in it seemed to have a function, just like the man who stood before her. "What about the light?" Thomas asked, his voice rough from years of solitude. Mara swallowed hard, her anger bubbling to the surface. "Why do you keep it burning? What's the point when it can't save anyone?" Thomas's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Mara thought he might throw her out. But instead, he turned away, walking toward the window where the sea stretched out before them, vast and uncaring. "I keep it burning because it's my duty," he said quietly, "and because I made a promise." The next morning brought no relief from the rising tension in the air. The sky was a steel gray, and the wind had begun to howl through the cliffs with a fury that sent shutters banging against the windows of the small cottages in the village below. The people of the village were bustling with preparations for the coming storm, battening down their homes and securing their boats in the harbor. The storm was no ordinary one. It was the kind that could bring ruin, the kind that made even seasoned sailors wary of venturing out. In the lighthouse, Thomas watched it all from the narrow window, his expression grim but calm. The storm didn't scare him. In fact, it barely registered. He had faced worse tempests in his time, and the lighthouse had withstood them all. His focus remained singular, keeping the light burning. He had no time for fear. But down in the village, Mara's frustration had grown into something more. After her brief, tense conversation with Thomas the day before, she couldn't shake the feeling of being dismissed. His promise to Eleanor, whatever it was, seemed to carry more weight than anything else, including the lives of those still here. The lighthouse had failed to save her brother, and yet Thomas acted as though the light was some kind of sacred duty. The village streets bustled with activity, but Mara felt a gnawing emptiness inside. She was preparing for the storm like everyone else, tying down windows and bringing supplies inside, but her mind was on the lighthouse. She had heard the warnings from the village council. This storm would be one of the worst in recent memory, and everyone was advised to take shelter as soon as possible. Even the fishing boats, usually lined up neatly in the harbor, had been pulled ashore or tied down with extra caution. As Mara worked alongside the other villagers, she overheard murmurs about Thomas. Some of the older residents whispered that the lighthouse keeper was too obsessed with the past, too buried in grief to be trusted to act in the village's best interest. "If the storm gets too bad, will he even be able to keep the light burning?" one woman muttered to another. Mara's jaw tightened. She knew what they were saying wasn't entirely unfair. Thomas seemed lost in his own world, disconnected from the present. But despite her frustration with him, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of understanding. She, too, had struggled with grief and had left her angry, bitter toward the sea that had stolen her brother. But anger wasn't going to stop the storm, and Thomas, whether he was aware of it or not, was responsible for more than just his promise to Eleanor. He was responsible for the safety of every ship that sailed close to their treacherous shores. The hours passed, and the wind began to howl louder, like a living beast pushing its way through the narrow streets. The sea swelled in the distance, waves crashing higher and harder against the rocks. The storm was coming fast. In the late afternoon, a council member, an older man named Gregory, approached Mara as she finished securing the shutters of her cottage. "The storm's getting closer," he said, his face lined with worry. "We're advising everyone to take shelter before nightfall. You should head inside soon." Mara nodded, but her gaze drifted to the path that led up to the lighthouse. The light had been a beacon for as long as she could remember, but with Thomas so absorbed in his own world, she wasn't sure if it would remain shining through the storm. "What about the lighthouse?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. Gregory glanced up toward the cliff, his expression uncertain. Thomas knows what he's doing, but he hesitated, then continued. If he's too caught up in the past, that light might go out when we need it most. That was all Mara needed to hear. As Gregory turned to leave, Mara made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait and watch the village be put at risk. If Thomas refused to acknowledge what was happening around him, someone had to make sure the light stayed on. She grabbed her heavy coat and set off toward the lighthouse. The wind whipped around Mara as she climbed a steep path to the lighthouse, its roar now almost deafening. Each step felt like a battle, the storm pushing her back, trying to drive her down the cliffside. But her determination carried her forward. She could barely see the lighthouse through the dense fog and swirling mist, but she knew it was there, standing tall against the raging elements, just as it always had. When she finally reached the heavy wooden door, she didn't knock this time. Instead, she shoved it open with a force that surprised even her, stumbling inside, out of breath, and soaked from the sea spray. The interior of the lighthouse was eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Thomas was there as she expected, methodically checking the equipment, adjusting the flame of the lantern that powered the light. He looked up, surprised to see her again. "Mara," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What are you doing here?" "The storm," she said between breaths. "It's worse than we thought. You can't be up here alone. The village is counting on you. We need the light." Thomas regarded her with a calm that bordered on indifference. "The light will stay on. That's what I promised." "I know," Mara snapped, her frustration spilling over. "But your promise isn't just about Eleanor. It's about the entire village. It's about the ships out there, the people who need this light to survive." Thomas frowned, his expression darkening. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," she shouted, her voice rising over the distant howl of the wind. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're so caught up in a promise to a dead woman that you've forgotten the living." Her words seemed to hit him like a wave. Thomas turned back to the lantern, adjusting the flame again in silence. For a moment, Mara thought she had gone too far, that she had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. But when Thomas finally spoke, his voice was low, strained. "I made a promise to keep this light burning," he said, "and I'll keep it no matter what it takes." Mara stepped closer, her tone softening slightly. "Thomas, keeping the light burning isn't just about holding on to the past. It's about saving people now. We need you to be here, not back in time with Eleanor." Thomas didn't respond immediately. His hands stilled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Mara saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the wind outside howled with a new ferocity, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. The light flickered, just for a second, and then returned to its steady glow. Mara's breath caught in her throat. "You see," she whispered, "it's starting. The storm is going to test us both." Thomas looked out the window, watching as the waves rose higher, their white caps glowing in the dimming evening light. "The light will stay on," he repeated, but his voice no longer held the same certainty. The storm hit the village with an unrelenting force, a wall of wind and rain that hammered against the small cottages and rattled their very foundations. Windows shuddered under the strain, and shutters that had been hastily nailed down earlier in the day now flapped wildly, threatening to break free. The sea had turned into a roiling mass of fury, waves crashing against the rocks in towering surges, spraying salt water far inland. Inside their homes, the villagers huddled together, listening to the relentless howl of the storm and praying that their preparations would hold. Some whispered prayers for their families, others muttered words of caution, knowing that even the most well-built structures could fall under the power of nature's wrath. But all of them, in some way, were thinking about the lighthouse and the man who kept it. The light had always been a beacon of safety, its steady beams slicing through the thickest fog and guiding ships away from the jagged rocks that lay hidden beneath the surface. But tonight, as the storm raged with unprecedented fury, the villagers knew that the lighthouse would have to withstand forces greater than ever before. Gregory, the council member who had warned Mara earlier, paced nervously in his home. His thoughts kept drifting to the lighthouse, wondering if Thomas would truly be able to keep the light on. He had seen the toll that grief had taken on the man, and while Thomas had always been dependable, this storm was different. Gregory muttered to himself, the worry etched in every line of his face. At the same time, down by the docks, the harbor master was making a last, desperate attempt to secure the remaining fishing boats. The wind whipped the ropes from his hands, and rain battered his face, making it almost impossible to see. The sea had already swallowed 2 boats that had been left too close to the shore, and he could only hope that the others would survive the night. Above it all, the lighthouse stood as it always had, its light cutting through the storm, unwavering for now. Inside the lighthouse, Mara and Thomas stood in tense silence, the weight of the storm pressing in on them from all sides. The sound of the wind slamming against the walls was deafening, and every gust seemed to shake the tower to its core. The light still shone, but its steady glow felt fragile in the face of nature's fury. Mara glanced out the window, watching as the waves continued to rise, battering the cliffs with a ferocity that made her stomach churn. She couldn't remember a storm like this one. The sea seemed almost alive, a beast bent on destruction. And yet, Thomas stood beside her, still calm, still determined to keep the light burning. She wanted to believe in him, wanted to believe that the lighthouse would hold, that Thomas would somehow manage to keep his promise. But a nagging doubt lingered in her mind. What if the light went out? What if the storm became too much, even for Thomas? Are you sure this place can withstand it? Mara asked, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. Thomas didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rotating lantern, watching the light move in its familiar, steady rhythm. It has to, he replied, though his voice carried a hint of the doubt that had begun to creep into his thoughts. Mara sighed, running a hand through her wet hair. What happens if it doesn't? He turned to her then, and for a moment, Mara saw something in his expression that surprised her. A flicker of vulnerability, a trace of fear that he had been hiding beneath his stoic exterior. I don't know, he admitted. I've never had to think about that. Mara nodded, biting her lip. She had hoped for a more reassuring answer, but at least Thomas was being honest. The truth was, no one could predict what would happen tonight. The storm was too powerful, too unpredictable. As the minutes stretched on, the storm only intensified. The wind howled louder, the rain pounded harder, and the walls of the lighthouse trembled under the strain. Mara paced the small room, unable to sit still, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the tower, followed by a violent shudder that made the floor lurch beneath their feet. Mara gasped, gripping the edge of a table to steady herself. What was that? She asked, her voice tinged with panic. Thomas moved quickly toward the window, peering out into the storm. His face paled. One of the beams, he said, his voice low. The structure's starting to give. For a moment, neither of them moved. The realization of what was happening sank in like stone, cold and heavy in the pit of Mara's stomach. The lighthouse, the very thing that had stood as a symbol of strength and guidance for so long, was now vulnerable. And if it fell, the consequences could be catastrophic. Thomas, however, was already in motion. He grabbed a lantern from a nearby shelf and handed it to Mara. Take this, he said, his voice sharp with urgency. We need to check the supports. Mara hesitated for only a second before taking the lantern. The look in Thomas's eyes was enough to silence any protests. Whatever was happening to the lighthouse, it wasn't just about the structure itself, it was about the light, the beacon that so many relied on, the promise he had made. They descended the narrow staircase, the tower creaking ominously with each gust of wind. As they reached the lower levels, Mara could feel the cold dampness seeping through the stone walls. The storm was invading every part of the lighthouse now, making it feel as though the structure itself was being consumed by the sea. At the base of the tower, Thomas knelt beside one of the main support beams, his hands running over the wood, searching for cracks. Mara held the lantern close, illuminating the area as best she could, but the flickering light made it difficult to see. "Is it bad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the jagged edge of a crack that had split the beam nearly in half. He swore under his breath. "It's worse than I thought," he muttered. "If this beam gives, the whole tower could go with it." Mara's heart raced. "What do we do?" Thomas stood up, his face set in a grim expression. "We reinforce it. It's the only thing we can do." Mara watched as Thomas moved with a sense of purpose she hadn't seen in him before. He gathered tools and wooden planks, working quickly despite the howling wind that seemed determined to tear the lighthouse apart. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of his responsibility bearing down on him. This wasn't just about the storm, it was about his promise, the one thing he had left. As they worked together to reinforce the beam, Mara found herself thinking about their conversation earlier. She had accused him of being stuck in the past, of holding on to a promise that no longer mattered. But now, as they fought to save the lighthouse, she realized she had been wrong. This wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about something bigger, something that had become part of who Thomas was. They worked in silence, the storm raging outside, the lighthouse groaning under the strain. Mara's hands shook as she helped Thomas secure the planks in place, her breath coming in short gasps as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. And then, just as they finished reinforcing the beam, the light above them flickered. It was barely noticeable at first, just a brief hesitation in the steady glow. But Mara saw it, and so did Thomas. His face paled, his eyes widening with alarm. "The light," he whispered. Another flicker, this time longer. The wind howled louder, and the walls of the tower shuddered once more. "We need to get back up there," Thomas said, his voice urgent. "Now." They raced up the stairs, their hearts pounding in unison with the storm. When they reached the top, Mara could see that the light had dimmed, its once brilliant beam now struggling against the darkness that pressed in on all sides. Thomas rushed to the lantern, his hands moving frantically to adjust the flame, to coax it back to life. But the storm had taken its toll. The light flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, all Mara could hear was the sound of the wind, the crash of the waves, and her own panicked breathing. The darkness was suffocating, as if the storm had finally consumed them whole. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Thomas whispered, "It's gone." Mara's heart sank. The light, the one thing that had stood against the storm, the one thing that had been their hope, was gone. But as she stood there, staring out into the blackness, Mara felt something stir inside her. A flicker of determination, a spark of hope. The storm wasn't over, and neither were they. "Not yet," she said, her voice steady. "We can fix it." Thomas looked at her, his expression a mixture of despair and disbelief. But Mara held his gaze, refusing to give in to the darkness. "We can fix it," she repeated. "We have to." The silence after the light went out was deafening. The storm raged on, battering the lighthouse with relentless fury. But inside, there was a stillness that felt far more ominous. Thomas stood frozen beside the lantern, his hands hovering over the extinguished flame, his face pale and gaunt in the dim light from the storm outside. Mara stepped forward, her pulse racing in her ears. "Thomas, we need to do something." He didn't move, his eyes fixed on the dead lantern as if staring at it long enough might bring it back to life. The weight of his failure, the realization that the one thing he had sworn to protect, the light, Eleanor's light, was gone, seemed to paralyze him. "Thomas." Mara's voice cut through the fog of despair that had settled over him. "You can't just give up. The storm is still out there. People need this light." Slowly, Thomas turned to face her, his expression one of hollow resignation. "It's over," he whispered. "The light is out. There's nothing left." Mara felt a surge of frustration and anger rise in her chest. No, it's not over. You're still here, and I'm still here. We can fix this. We have to. Thomas shook his head, stepping away from the lantern as though it had betrayed him. I made a promise, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I promised her I'd keep it burning, and now I've failed. The rawness in his voice cut deep, and for a moment, Mara didn't know how to respond. She understood the weight of promises, the pain of loss. She had lost her brother to the sea, and part of her had blamed the lighthouse, blamed Thomas, for not being enough to save him. But standing there now, in the face of the storm, she realized something. This isn't just about Eleanor, Mara said softly, stepping closer to him. You've been keeping this light burning for everyone, for the village, for the ships at sea. Your promise to her, it's become something bigger than you or her. It's about the living, Thomas, the people who still need you. For the first time since the light had gone out, Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. The despair in his eyes was still there, but now there was something else, something that hinted at the man he had been before grief had consumed him. And what if I can't? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I can't fix it? Mara met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. Then we try. We owe it to them to try. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and then, with a slow nod, he seemed to come back to life. He turned to the lantern, his hands moving with purpose once more, checking the mechanisms, searching for the source of the problem. Mara watched him for a moment, then began gathering tools, following his lead. They worked together in silence, the storm howling around them, the walls of the lighthouse trembling with every gust of wind. But inside, a new determination had taken hold. The light might be out, but they weren't done fighting. Thomas adjusted the lantern's wick, his brow furrowed in concentration. The storm's too strong, he muttered. The wind must have forced air into the chamber, snuffing out the flame. We'll need to reinforce it before relighting. Mara nodded, though she barely understood the technicalities of the lighthouse's inner workings. What mattered was that Thomas wasn't giving up. He had found a way to push through the grief, to focus on something beyond his own pain. And that was all the hope she needed. Together, they set about reinforcing the lantern, securing it against the storm as best they could. Every moment felt like an eternity, the urgency of the situation pressing down on them, but neither of them spoke of failure. The light had to come back. There was no other option. When Thomas finally struck the match, his hands steady despite the storm raging around them, Mara held her breath. The tiny flame flickered for a moment, then caught, growing into a steady, warm glow. They watched in silence as the light grew, and the room began to fill with the familiar, comforting brightness. For the first time in hours, Mara exhaled. The light was back, but there was no time for relief. The storm was still in full force, and outside the lighthouse, danger loomed as high as the waves battering the cliffs. Thomas and Mara knew that reigniting the light was only the first step. The real challenge lay in keeping it on. Thomas moved quickly, adjusting the mechanism that rotated the light. It's holding for now, he muttered, more to himself than to Mara. But we'll need to monitor it closely. One wrong gust, and it could go out again. Mara nodded, but her attention was drawn to the window. Through the sheets of rain and the blackness of the night, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A ship, barely visible in the distance, being tossed about like a toy on the monstrous waves. It was far too close to the cliffs. Thomas, she whispered, her voice trembling. There's a ship out there. He looked up sharply, following her gaze. His face drained of color when he saw it. The ship's mast silhouetted against the storm, dangerously close to the rocky shore. They're too close, he said, his voice filled with dread. If they don't see the light in time. Mara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment the lighthouse had always been meant for. It wasn't just about keeping the light on. It was about saving lives. And now, with the storm at its peak, those lives were hanging by the thinnest of threads. "We need to keep the light steady," Thomas said, his voice suddenly sharp with purpose. "If they see it, they might have a chance to turn away from the rocks." Mara nodded, her own hand shaking as she helped Thomas adjust the lantern, making sure the light shone as brightly and steadily as possible. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. The ship, barely visible through the storm, pitched wildly on the waves. Mara could see the crew scrambling on the deck, trying to regain control, but the storm was merciless. The waves slammed into the hull, threatening to dash it against the rocks at any moment. "They're coming too fast," Mara said, her voice rising with panic. "They're not going to make it." Thomas clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the ship. "They will," he said, his voice cold and determined. "They have to." The minutes stretched on, the ship inching ever closer to the cliffs. Mara's heart raced as she watched, her breath catching every time the ship lurched on the waves. She could feel the desperation, the helplessness of the men on board, and she knew that if the light failed them now, there would be no saving them. Suddenly, the ship turned. It was a small movement at first, barely noticeable, but then it happened again, another turn, this time more deliberate. The crew had seen the light. They were steering away from the rocks. Mara's chest tightened with hope. "They see it," she whispered. "They're turning." Thomas didn't respond, his attention still fixed on the ship. His hands were steady on the lantern, adjusting it as the storm continued to batter the lighthouse. But in his eyes, Mara could see the same glimmer of hope that she felt in her own chest. The ship fought against the waves, slowly but surely making its way out of the danger zone. It wasn't safe yet, but it was moving farther from the cliffs with each passing moment. Mara could hardly believe it. Against all odds, they had done it. The light had guided the ship away from certain disaster. As the ship disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the storm, Mara felt her legs give way. She sank to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The adrenaline that had kept her going drained away, leaving her exhausted and trembling. Thomas remained standing, his gaze still fixed on the window, but his shoulders had relaxed, and for the first time since the storm had started, he allowed himself to breathe. The ship was safe. Mara looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "We did it." Thomas turned to her, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The storm outside still raged, but inside the lighthouse, there was a strange sense of calm, a quiet understanding that they had faced something far greater than either of them alone, and had survived. The storm wasn't over, but for now, the light still shone. The ship had sailed beyond the reach of the storm, but the battle within the lighthouse was far from over. As the wind howled and the rain lashed against the windows, the structure itself seemed to groan under the relentless assault. Every gust felt like a warning that the lighthouse was nearing its limit, that it couldn't hold much longer. Thomas and Mara stood by the lantern, the room illuminated by the flickering, fragile light they had fought so hard to restore. The worst of the storm was still ahead of them, and they both knew that the next few hours would be critical. The light had to stay on, no matter what. Mara's body ached from the strain of reinforcing the lighthouse, her hands raw from gripping the rough tools. She wanted to rest, to close her eyes, and let the exhaustion take her, but the storm wouldn't allow it. They had won a small victory, but the war was still raging outside. Thomas moved with the same steady determination that had carried him through the night. His face was pale, and his clothes were soaked through, but he never faltered. He was focused entirely on the light, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. And, in a way, it was. Mara watched him in silence for a moment, the reality of the situation settling in. They had saved one ship, but there were no guarantees they would save another. The storm was unforgiving, and the lighthouse, despite its strength, was vulnerable. It wouldn't take much more to push it beyond its limits. "You should rest," Mara said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind earlier. "You've done enough." Thomas shook his head without looking at her. "The light has to stay on. I'll rest when it's over." Mara understood. She felt the same compulsion, the same drive to keep fighting, even though her body screamed for relief. She wasn't about to give up now, not when they had come this far, but the storm had other plans. Without warning, a deafening crack echoed through the tower, and the floor beneath them lurched violently. Mara stumbled, barely catching herself on the edge of a table. Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat as she looked to Thomas. "What was that?" she asked, fear lacing her words. Thomas didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, where a web of cracks had begun to spread across the plaster. He swore under his breath and moved toward the staircase. "The structure's failing," he said, his voice grim. "We need to get down to the supports. Now." Mara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a lantern and followed Thomas down the narrow spiral staircase, each step feeling more precarious than the last. The walls seemed to close in around them as the lighthouse groaned and shuddered under the force of the storm. Every gust of wind felt like it could bring the whole tower crashing down. When they reached the base of the lighthouse, the full extent of the damage became clear. One of the main support beams had split, a deep crack running down its length. The beam was still holding, but just barely. If it gave way, the lighthouse would collapse, and the light would be extinguished for good. Thomas moved quickly, grabbing a set of heavy wooden planks and motioning for Mara to help. Together, they worked to reinforce the beam, their hands trembling from both exhaustion and fear. The storm howled outside, as if mocking their efforts, but they didn't stop. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. As they hammered the last plank into place, another violent gust of wind slammed into the tower, and the walls shook with a terrifying intensity. The lighthouse felt as though it were being torn apart, piece by piece. Mara's breath came in short gasps as she leaned against the wall, her legs trembling from the exertion. "Will it hold?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow, his expression grim. "It has to." But even as he spoke, Mara could see the doubt in his eyes. They had done everything they could, but the storm was relentless, and the lighthouse had already endured so much. It felt like they were fighting a losing battle, one that would end with the light being snuffed out and the tower reduced to rubble. Still, they had to try. They couldn't give up now, not after everything they had fought for. "We should get back to the lantern," Thomas said, his voice tight with urgency. "If it goes out again." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They both knew what would happen if the light failed. The ships that relied on it would be left to fend for themselves in the storm, and there would be no saving them. Mara nodded, pushing herself away from the wall and following Thomas back up the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the storm was pressing down on them, but they kept moving. They had no other choice. When they reached the lantern room, the light was still shining, but it flickered weakly, as if the storm had drained it of its strength. Thomas immediately set to work, adjusting the mechanism and feeding more oil into the flame. Mara stood by the window, watching the storm rage outside. The wind howled, and the waves crashed against the rocks with a force that shook the very ground beneath them. It was hard to believe that anything could survive out there in the chaos. But then, through the darkness, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. "Another ship, Thomas," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "There's another one." Thomas looked up sharply, his eyes following her gaze to the distant ship. It was barely visible through the sheets of rain and fog, but there was no mistaking it. Another vessel, caught in the storm, heading straight for the rocks. He swore under his breath, his hands moving faster as he worked to steady the light. "We can't let it go out," he muttered, more to himself than to Mara. "Not now." Mara's heart raced as she watched the ship draw closer, its silhouette looming in the darkness. The storm was pushing it dangerously close to the cliffs, and there was no sign that the crew had seen the light. If the lantern flickered again, if the beam wavered for even a second, it could be too late. "We're running out of time," Mara said, her voice trembling. "They're not going to see it." Thomas didn't respond, his focus entirely on the lantern. The light was still flickering, unsteady in the face of the storm, but he refused to give up. He adjusted the flame again, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Mara clenched her fists, her knuckles white as she watched the ship inch closer to the cliffs. Every second felt like a lifetime, the tension in the room thick enough to suffocate. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the desperation rising in her chest. And then, just as the ship seemed to be on the brink of disaster, the lights steadied. The beam cut through the darkness, bright and unwavering. "They've seen it," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the ship began to turn, slowly but surely steering away from the deadly rocks. It was still being tossed about by the waves, still at the mercy of the storm, but the light had given them a fighting chance. For the second time that night, they had saved the ship from certain destruction. But the storm wasn't over yet, and the lighthouse still stood on the edge of collapse. The wind roared, louder than ever before, shaking the lighthouse with a ferocity that made the walls tremble. Thomas and Mara stood side by side, watching the ship navigate through the storm with the aid of the now steady light. But despite the small victory, the danger had not passed. The storm still raged, and the structure of the lighthouse was hanging on by a thread. Thomas felt the exhaustion deep in his bones, a weight that had settled over him after hours of fighting both the storm and his own doubts. Every muscle in his body ached, but there was no time for rest. The light was holding for now, but the damage to the lighthouse was severe, and there was no telling how much longer it could withstand the storm's wrath. "We need more oil," Thomas said, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw from the hours of shouting over the wind. "The flame won't last without it." Mara nodded, her face pale and drawn, but her resolve unshaken. "Where's the reserve?" "Downstairs," Thomas replied, his gaze flicking to the staircase. "But with the damage to the supports." He didn't finish the sentence, but Mara understood. The lower levels of the lighthouse were unstable, and every step they took could bring the entire structure crashing down. But without more oil, the light would fade, and all their efforts would have been in vain. "I'll go," Mara said, her voice firm. Thomas shook his head. "No, it's too dangerous." Mara met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "We don't have a choice, Thomas. You need to stay here and keep the lights steady. I'll get the oil." He hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to protect Mara, to keep her out of harm's way, but they both knew what was at stake. The light was their only hope. Without it, the storm would claim more lives. "Be careful," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with worry. Mara nodded, offering him a small, reassuring smile before turning toward the stairs. The lantern she carried cast long shadows on the walls as she descended, the creaking of the wooden steps beneath her feet a constant reminder of how fragile the lighthouse had become. Each step felt like a gamble, the floorboards groaning under the strain of the storm. Mara's heart raced, her pulse quickening with every ominous sound. She could feel the weight of the entire structure above her, could hear the wind screaming through the cracks in the walls. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she reached the bottom, the damage was worse than she had feared. The supports were buckling, the floor uneven beneath her boots. Water had seeped in through the cracks, pooling in the corners of the room where the reserve oil was stored. The entire foundation of the lighthouse felt like it could give way at any moment. Mara moved quickly, grabbing the heavy containers of oil and hoisting them into her arms. The weight of them nearly pulled her off balance, but she steadied herself, her determination keeping her upright. She had to get back to the lantern. She had to keep the light burning. As she made her way back up the stairs, her muscles straining under the load, the lighthouse groaned again, a deep, unsettling sound that echoed through the narrow passage. Mara quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she climbed higher. And then, just as she reached the top of the staircase, the lighthouse shuddered violently. Mara stumbled, barely managing to catch herself before she fell. The oil containers slipped from her grasp, but she managed to hold on to them, her knuckles white from the effort. Her heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't afford to fall. Not now. When she finally reached the lantern room, Thomas was waiting for her, his face a mask of relief and worry. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained. Mara nodded, though her legs trembled beneath her. "I've got the oil," she said, setting the containers down beside him. "We can keep the light burning." Thomas immediately went to work, refilling the lantern with the fresh oil and adjusting the flame. The light flared back to life, brighter and steadier than before, cutting through the darkness of the storm like a blade. For a moment, there was silence between them, the only sound the steady hum of the lantern and the distant roar of the storm outside. The worst of the night was behind them, but they both knew the fight wasn't over. Mara sank into a chair, her body shaking from exhaustion. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling inside her for hours. She had never felt so tired, so drained. Thomas stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the lantern, his mind still focused on the task at hand. But there was something different in his posture, a subtle shift in the way he carried himself. The weight of his grief, the burden of his promise to Eleanor, seemed to have lifted, if only slightly. He had fought through the storm. He had kept the light burning. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't expected: peace. "Mara," he said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet. She opened her eyes, looking up at him. "Thank you," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity, "for everything." Mara smiled weakly, too tired to respond with words, but the gratitude in her expression was clear. They had faced the storm together, and in the process, they had both found something they had lost: hope. The storm still raged outside, but inside the lighthouse, the light shone bright and steady. And as long as that light remained, there was a chance for survival. The storm finally passed in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost surreal after the relentless chaos of the night. The wind had died down to a soft whisper, the rain now a gentle drizzle that tapped against the windows of the lighthouse. But the damage left in the wake of the storm was undeniable. The village below, once bustling with life, lay in a quiet, somber state. The docks were in ruins, several boats had been smashed against the rocks, and debris littered the narrow streets. Inside the lighthouse, Thomas and Mara stood in silence, both of them staring out at the broken landscape through the fogged windows. The light still shone, its steady beam cutting through the gray dawn, but the price of keeping it on was clear in every crack in the walls, every tremor in the structure. Thomas hadn't spoken much since they had managed to keep the light burning through the worst of the storm. He had worked tirelessly, ensuring the flames stayed steady until the very last gust of wind had passed. Now, as the storm's fury subsided, the weight of the night's events seemed to settle on him like a heavy fog. Mara sat slumped in a chair by the window, her body aching from exhaustion, her mind still racing from everything that had happened. The adrenaline that had kept her going through the night had finally faded, leaving her drained and emotionally raw. But despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of quiet relief, a feeling that they had somehow survived the impossible. "You should rest," Thomas said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting over the storm. He hadn't taken his eyes off the horizon since the storm had ended, as if he were waiting for something more to happen. Mara glanced at him, too tired to argue. "You should rest too." Thomas shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the sea. "I'll rest when the light is no longer needed." Mara wanted to protest, but she knew it was pointless. Thomas had spent years living by the light, clinging to it as if it were the last thread of his old life, the only thing connecting him to Eleanor. Even after everything they had been through, even after saving the ships, his mind remained tethered to that promise. She stood slowly, her legs shaky beneath her, and moved to stand beside him. Together, they watched the sea, both of them lost in their own thoughts. "The village," Mara began, her voice soft. "Do you think they're all right?" Thomas nodded, though his expression remained grim. They'll rebuild. They always do. Mara looked down at the docks, her heart heavy with the knowledge of how much had been lost. The village was resilient, but the storm had taken a toll. Lives had been altered, homes destroyed, and yet, in the midst of it all, the lighthouse had stood firm, a beacon of hope through the darkness. "We saved them," Mara said, almost to herself. Thomas didn't respond right away, but after a long pause, he turned to look at her, his face etched with a quiet kind of understanding. "You saved them," he said. "You kept me going when I would have let the light go out." Mara blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had come to the lighthouse to confront him, to accuse him of being too lost in his grief to care about the living. And yet, here they stood, both of them changed by the storm. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, in what felt like years, Thomas smiled. It was faint, just a flicker of warmth that passed across his face, but it was there, a sign that the storm had shifted something inside him as well. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a long battle, a moment of peace before the world started turning again. They both knew that once the village awoke, the reality of the storm's destruction would hit them fully. But for now, in the soft light of morning, they could just stand and breathe. The village slowly came to life as the sun rose higher in the sky. People emerged from their homes, taking stock of the damage, exchanging quiet words of relief and sorrow as they assessed the destruction. The docks were in ruins, several fishing boats lost to the sea, and the streets were strewn with debris from the storm's violent onslaught. From their vantage point in the lighthouse, Thomas and Mara watched the villagers begin the long, arduous process of rebuilding. It was a familiar sight. Storms had come before, and storms would come again. But this one had been different. This storm had tested the village and the lighthouse in ways neither of them could have predicted. Thomas turned from the window, finally breaking his vigil. He moved toward the small desk where he kept his logs, his hands still steady despite the weariness in his bones. As he picked up the old weathered book, his fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper that had been tucked between the pages. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Mara asked, noticing the change in his expression. Thomas unfolded the paper slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the handwriting. It was a letter written by Eleanor in the weeks before she had fallen ill. He had forgotten it was there, buried under years of routine and the weight of his promise. His hands trembled as he held the paper, his eyes scanning the familiar words. Mara watched in silence, sensing that this was something deeply personal, something that had been left unfinished for too long. Thomas read the letter quietly, his heart aching with every word. Eleanor had written to him about the lighthouse, about the light that had become such a central part of their lives. But more than that, she had written about him, about her hopes for his future after she was gone. She had known, even then, that she wouldn't live forever. And in her final words, she had left him a wish, one that he hadn't been ready to hear until now. "Keep the light burning, my love, but don't let it become your life. The sea will take many things from you, but it cannot take your spirit. Promise me, Thomas, that when I am gone, you will find a way to live again, not for me, but for yourself." The words hit him like a wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years clinging to the light, to the promise he had made to her, that he had forgotten what she had truly wanted for him. Mara watched as Thomas lowered the letter, his expression distant and pained. She didn't need to ask what it said. She could see the weight of it in his eyes. "Eleanor," Thomas began, his voice thick with emotion. "She wanted me to keep the light burning, but not like this. Not forever." Mara nodded, understanding without needing him to explain further. "She didn't want you to stop living." Thomas exhaled, his breath shaky as he folded the letter and placed it carefully back in the logbook. "No, she didn't." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Eleanor's words settling over them like the quiet after the storm. Thomas had fulfilled his promise to her, But now it was time for him to find a new purpose, one that wasn't tied to the past. As they stood together in the fading light of the lantern room, the sound of the villagers working to rebuild their homes drifted up from below. The world was moving on, and so too, it seemed, would Thomas. "I think," he said slowly, his voice quiet but resolute, "it's time for someone else to take over the lighthouse." Mara blinked, surprised by his words. "You're leaving?" Thomas nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I've kept the light burning for long enough. It's time for me to live." Mara didn't know what to say. After everything they had been through, the idea of Thomas leaving the lighthouse felt strange, almost surreal. But as she looked at him, at the man who had fought through his grief and found his way through the storm, she realized that this was what Eleanor had wanted all along. "I think she'd be proud of you," Mara said softly. Thomas smiled, his eyes softening with gratitude. "I hope so." They stood together for a while longer, watching the light as it continued to shine over the sea, a beacon for those who needed it. But now it was more than just a symbol of Thomas's promise. It was a symbol of hope, of survival, and of the future that lay ahead. For both of them, days had passed since the storm, and life in the village had begun to return to a semblance of normalcy. The docks were being rebuilt, the streets cleared of debris, and the villagers, ever resilient, were picking up the pieces left behind by the tempest. The scars of the storm were still visible, but there was hope in the air, a sense of renewal after the devastation. Thomas stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the sea. The lighthouse loomed behind him, its light still shining, as it always had, a steady, unbroken beam cutting through the morning fog. But for the first time in years, Thomas wasn't focused on the light. His thoughts were elsewhere, carried by the waves and the winds that swept over the cliffs. He had made his decision. After years of keeping the light burning, of clinging to the promise he had made to Eleanor, he was finally ready to let go. Not of her memory, he would carry that with him always, but of the life he had built around the lighthouse. It was time for someone else to take up the mantle, to continue the work he had started. Mara approached from behind, her footsteps soft on the grassy path. She had been spending more time at the lighthouse in recent days, helping with repairs and quietly observing Thomas as he prepared for his departure. She still wasn't sure what the future held for either of them, but she knew one thing: Thomas had found peace, and that was something she hadn't been sure he would ever achieve. "Everything's in order," she said, coming to stand beside him. "The council's approved a new keeper. He'll be here by the end of the week." Thomas nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "I always thought I would die here, watching the light. But now it feels like the right time to leave." Mara smiled softly. "Eleanor would be happy to know you're moving on." Thomas glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You think so?" "I know so." They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching as the waves lapped gently against the rocks below. The sea, once so violent and unforgiving, now seemed calm and peaceful, a reflection of the journey Thomas had taken. It had tested him, broken him down, but in the end, he had found his way through the storm. "I don't know where I'll go," Thomas admitted after a while. "The world beyond this place feels so unfamiliar." "You'll figure out," Mara replied. "You've spent so long helping others find their way. It's time for you to find yours." Thomas smiled, the weight of years of grief finally lifting from his heart. "You're right." They turned back toward the lighthouse, the beam of light cutting through the morning mist, steady as ever. Thomas had kept his promise, not just to Eleanor, but to the village, to the sailors who had depended on him, and to himself. And now, as he prepared to leave the lighthouse behind, he realized that the light would continue to shine, even without him. The new keeper would take up his post, and the lighthouse would remain a beacon of hope for all who needed it. But Thomas had learned that the light wasn't just a physical thing. It was something he carried with him, something that lived inside him, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. He turned to Mara, his expression thoughtful. "What about you? What will you do now?" Mara shrugged, her gaze drifting back to the sea. I don't know. I never thought I'd end up at the lighthouse, but now that I'm here, it feels like there's something left for me to do. Thomas studied her for a moment, sensing the same uncertainty he had felt. Mara had come to the lighthouse to confront him, to challenge the way he had lived in the shadow of his grief. But in doing so, she had found her own path, one that was still unfolding before her. You could stay, Thomas offered gently. Take over the lighthouse if you want it. I think you'd be a good keeper. Mara laughed softly, shaking her head. I don't think I'm ready for that yet, but maybe one day. Thomas nodded, understanding her hesitation. They were both at a crossroads, both standing on the edge of something new and unknown. But unlike before, the uncertainty didn't feel frightening. It felt like an opportunity. As they made their way back toward the lighthouse, Thomas paused for a moment, looking up at the tall, familiar structure. The memories flooded back. Years spent tending the light, keeping the promise he had made to the woman he had loved more than anything in the world. He had thought that his life would end here, bound to the light and the sea. But now, he knew there was more waiting for him, beyond the horizon. Goodbye, Eleanor, he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. It wasn't a farewell of sadness, but one of peace. He had honored her, and now it was time for him to honor himself by living again. Mara watched him in quiet reflection, sensing the significance of the moment. She didn't speak, knowing that words weren't needed. They both understood what had been left behind and what lay ahead. As they reached the door of the lighthouse, Thomas glanced over his shoulder one last time. The light continued to shine, bright and unwavering, a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had learned. And as he stepped away from the lighthouse, the weight of the past finally released. He knew that no matter where life took him, the light would always be with him.